As some of you guys who might have checked out some of my other foreign, as they're often called, horror movies, or non-English movies really, I'm a big fan of finding these hidden gems. They're not necessarily hidden gems in the countries that they come from, they're probably pretty well known for the most part, but here in the West, or in more traditional English-speaking countries, they're not generally as well known. They're not really publicised as much, they tend to be more cult favourites. Movies like Troll Hunter, Old Boy, Train to Busan, which is of course this one. And one of the things that I really like about this movie, and this goes for a lot of foreign films, or in other words non-English speaking films, is that they have a different approach to horror than, say, an American horror film. In fact, for the most part, I would say that each country has its own unique style of horror. With American horror films, it tends to be, at least when it comes to original American horror, kind of this slasher theme to most of the most iconic American horror films. They have those iconic characters such as Freddy or Jason, and then you get the odd one here or there like The Thing, for instance, which stands out in a different way. Then you compare that to somewhere like here in England, for instance, and over here you tend to get more stuff which is grittier and a little bit more, not necessarily realistic, but less glamorous looking. It's more dirty, gritty, like in train stations or subways or sewers, that kind of stuff. And then you've got the well-known ones like 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later, those again, more gritty takes on the traditional concept of a zombie. Kind of savage. That's what I would say the feel of many British horror films are. They feel gritty and savage and unforgiving. Then you've got French horror, which I would say is similar in that regard. It's very unforgiving. It doesn't necessarily give you the happy ending that you might want from a horror film. And although that seems like an obvious thing to say, the way the French make their horror films makes it stand out more for me personally. Then you've got countries like Korea, for instance, which is where this movie comes from, and again, it doesn't have that glamorous edge to it. Regardless of whether or not they could have given it that, they chose, or didn't, for whatever reason, do that. And the result is that it makes the movie have a much more realistic feel. It feels more grounded, the characters look, act, and sound even more like real people rather than actors. And the fact that many people over here in English-speaking countries like America or the UK don't know these actors, for the most part, means that you can kind of take yourself away from that star power cliche that you would have in our films over here, such as seeing Kurt Russell pop up in The Thing or various other well-known people. That doesn't apply because most British or American audiences aren't going to know most of these Korean actors, even if they're the top star of the country. And that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. And that's an advantage for a Western horror audience because you can look at it and see all of the characters as just that, the character, rather than seeing the actor. And for me, that's a huge part of Train to Busan and movies like it. I enjoy the fact that I don't recognise anyone, that they all look and feel like real people. And the whole movie of Train to Busan has, I would say, a very grounded feel to it. It doesn't try to be huge in scope, like something such as World War Z might, for instance. I personally like that movie, but a lot of people don't. It goes all over the world, literally, in that film, and it feels very big. It's World War Z. Whereas other films like 28 Days Later, or even 28 Weeks Later, which is slightly larger scale, but still pretty small, or this one, Train to Busan, they keep it very grounded, very small, very contained, and on a train, very claustrophobic. You can't really get anywhere, you can't really jump off. The best you can do is get up on the roof and just hope for the best. And it works well. It works really well. In fact, I'm surprised that I hadn't heard of another zombie film perhaps doing this concept earlier. Maybe there have been some, but I haven't heard of them. Having this concept of a train full of zombies that you can't get away from, it just works. It's simple and it's effective. And I think for me personally, the two things that I enjoyed the most about the way Train to Busan is made are those two things. The fact that the people feel real, and the fact that the film itself takes place in a perfect environment to put the zombie creature as a monster to its best use. Zombies are at their best when you can't get away from them, because at the end of the day, you can get away from zombies. I mean, ultimately they'll be everywhere, and then obviously that becomes an issue, but at least at the beginning, you can run. Generally, they're not that quick, unless it's World War Z. These ones are a bit quicker, but they're not super fast. They run at basically the same speed that a normal person can anyway, so you can get away. In somewhere like a train, though, you can't. And as I said, I think that works really, really well. Another thing that I liked about this movie is the characters' interactions with each other. Not necessarily the happy interactions. Sometimes they rub each other up the wrong way, sometimes they argue. There are some characters who just straight up stab everyone in the back to take care of themselves, one character in particular, and I must admit I found that character very infuriating. But that's the point. That's why that character is there. My favourite character in the entire movie is easily this guy, I don't recall his name, but he's quite a big chap, looks like a bodybuilder, and he's awesome. He's funny, he's badass, and he was very well cast in the film. He's definitely my favourite character by far. The interplay between him and his pregnant wife is also fantastic. The fact that he's the biggest guy in the movie and he still kind of cowers around her is hilarious to watch, but also believable. It has that, again, real-world feel to it. And the way the film looks, tying into the realism factor, again complements that. The film doesn't go over the top in terms of the locations that it goes to, in terms of the visual spectacles that it tries to have, or even in terms of the way the zombies look. They don't really go over the top with it. You haven't got zombies with limbs hanging off or spewing liquids all over people. There are zombies in traditional zombie form, you know, funny eyes, blood here and there, and grey skin and veins popping out, which is what you'd expect, but they don't go ridiculous with it. It feels, again, like a believable disease, almost, that could happen. And another thing in a similar vein that this movie also does well, I personally think, is that it manages to give you the feeling of what would you do if you were in that scenario, in that situation. Whereas a lot of other zombie movies, although they may be great, they don't necessarily feel like that. I'll go again to World War Z. It's very polished, it's very clean, it's got very high production values, great casting, you know, great visual effects, but it feels a little abstract. The book, on the other hand, is very personal. I love the book of World War Z, I like it more than the movie, but in the movie it feels like you're just following this journey rather than actually being posed with the questions of how would you deal with this. It feels a bit taken aback, at least for me. Whereas in Train to Busan it doesn't. It feels more like 28 Days Later again, in as much as what if you were in this scenario? How would you cope? What would you do to survive? And I love that. That's the exact kind of feeling that you want to have in a survival zombie horror film. And by definition, pretty much all zombie horror films should be about survival. So I love this movie, if you can't tell. As far as downsides, I don't really feel that this movie has any significant downsides, to be honest. There are a couple of moments of CGI, especially from a distance, which you can tell is CGI, but again, this doesn't have the kind of budget which a big Hollywood blockbuster would have, and it's not really trying to be that kind of movie either. That's why those occasions of CGI aren't really used as much. There are some fantastic zombie pile-up effects, you know, like in World War Z when they're all climbing up over each other to get over the wall. There's some similar kind of visuals in this film, but inside the train instead, where people are just, or where zombies are just bursting out over each other to get to the fresh meat. That's great. Again, it gives this feeling of helplessness, that you're not really fighting zombies, because a zombie is like one thing that you could quite easily take down. The power of a zombie, when you put it into its basest form, is the same power that a virus has. It's so prolific. You can kill one, but how can you kill them all? You can't. You'd have to just get away. And the zombies in the film, especially in such a contained environment like a train, basically just a tube that's going real fast, they have this feeling of being almost like a rising water level inside the train. That yes, you might be the other side of a door for now, but you get the feeling that the water's probably going to burst through, and that's the way the zombies feel, like this endless flow of bodies just flowing towards you, trying to drown you. And I think that's fantastic. I love that about this film. It plays on that fear very well, and I guess it combines body horror in a more general kind of virus sense, like the fear of germs, legitimate fear of germs or contagions, and combines that with the claustrophobic environment of a train, and it works very well together. So overall, I love this film. And of course, that brings us to, as always, the ratings. Now, first of all, we have the story and the plot. And for the story and plot of Train to Busan, I'm going to give it a 7. Because the story isn't overly big, it doesn't try to be. There are some twists and turns, but not necessarily ones which are essential. You can actually miss some of the twists and turns, and you won't really miss much, because it's not about that. It's more about a moment in time in the lives of these people and how they deal with the situation, and that's the strength of the movie. But the story and what it does with that is very good. It wouldn't be fair to score it like a ridiculous 9 or a 10 out of 10, but a 7 to me is well above par and sits basically about right as to what I would say I feel about this film. As far as the characters, their motivations, the casting, as I was mentioning earlier, I'm going to give it a 9, which is of course an extremely high score, and I've mentioned some of the reasons why. The fact that here in English-speaking countries you don't recognise any of the people is a fantastic advantage to have, but also, even though you don't recognise them, they're not just cheap actors that you'd have in most, ironically, Western horror films. These throwaway, fodder kind of people that you don't really care about. Obviously there are people like that in this film that you don't really get to know because they're not in it long enough to, but the characters that you need to root for and that you need to follow and care about, they're rounded out well. You don't necessarily need a backstory, you just get a feel for what that character is all about through the journey of the film. Some are more courageous, some are more cowardly, some are just trying to survive, and the combination of everything works very well. As far as the visuals, the special effects, all that kind of thing, I'm going to give it an 8, because as I said, it's not as effects driven as a World War Z, for instance. It doesn't have the big, wide open, empty cityscapes or crazy visuals of something like 28 Days Later, especially at the start of the movie, or various other horror films, or specifically zombie movies. And it doesn't even have the necessarily huge crowds of zombies that you might typically expect. There are some scenes, such as in a train station and on the train itself, where you do have huge crowds of zombies, but not as much as you might expect, actually. It's more 1 or 2 zombies that take up most of the screen, and then all the rest of them are kind of this heaving mass behind them, which again is kind of an interesting way of doing it, because usually zombies aren't really given face-to-face screen time. They're kept at a distance to keep them dehumanized, whereas in this one there are certain scenes where you get to see zombies up close, and sometimes there will be people who you have seen earlier in the film, and again that adds this kind of awkward personalization to the zombies, because usually there's this mindset in a zombie film where once someone turns, and this goes for movies, games, literature, once someone turns from a human to a zombie, there is this automatic dehumanization that people have. They no longer view that person as a human, they view it as a thing. It's not a person anymore, it's just a threat. And that legitimizes whatever you want to do to that person. You want to bash their head in, you want to cut their head off, you want to blow them up, you want to chain them to something and just leave them there. I'm not saying that that's morally right or wrong, but what I'm saying is that this movie gives you an interesting little twinge of conscience when it comes to that. Because when you get face to face with somebody who maybe you knew as a friend or a family member, maybe 30 seconds ago, and now they're trying to eat you, it gives it that much more personal feel. And I like that. But overall, I'm giving it an 8 as far as the visuals go. As far as the music, the soundtrack, of course, sound effects, I'm going to give it another 7, because it didn't have a soundtrack which stayed with me like some other horror soundtracks do. In fact, there were certain scenes where the music is kind of unnoticeable, and that's effective. Again, it adds to the realism, it doesn't make it feel over the top. And sometimes a lack of music can be just as good as a ton of music, which is one of the reasons why I'm giving it a really good score of 7. And finally, for the most subjective, to me personally, of course, the rewatchability, the entertainment factor that it has both on your own or as a group watch with friends or family, I'm going to give it a 9. Because for me, this movie gets better every time you watch it. The first time I watched it, I enjoyed it, but I didn't necessarily love it. The second time, I liked it so much more. And now I would definitely say this is one of my favourite foreign or non-English horror movies that I've seen. Doubtless there are many more that I would love that I just haven't heard of or haven't seen, but this one I have, and I love it. I would definitely put it up there with stuff like Troll Hunter, for instance, which I also love. So overall, it's a very strong film in pretty much every regard, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. And as a tabulation of all 5 of those categories put together, I'm giving Train to Busan an overall score of 4 out of 5, which isn't the highest of horror movies that I've done, but that is very high, especially for a zombie film. I wouldn't necessarily always rate a zombie movie that high, because although I like them, I don't usually love them. I'm not a huge zombie fan. I tend to be more of a monster fan, which is a very different thing. But on this occasion, I love what they did with the film, I love the concept, the premise, and the way it was carried out, for me, is very effective. But overall, that's it for this review. Of course, I'd recommend checking it out if you get the chance, and I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.